Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Mike Ormsbee. Mike has done a lot of really great research in nutrition and exercise.
We started doing collagen work in the beginning because I didn't believe it. It was one of the things that my own data changed that I take it.
When people talk about genetics and stuff, I go, well, did you train really hard for 10 years consistently without any breaks?
That training piece is the biggest lever to pull. And the nutrition is great, but it is definitely the icing on top of that resistance training cake.
Welcome back to the Dr. Layne Norton podcast. Today, I'm interviewing Dr. Mike Ormsbee. Mike is a professor at Florida State University and the associate director of the Institute of Sports Science and Medicine at FSU. Mike has done a lot of really great research in nutrition and exercise and combinations of the two. And I really enjoyed this interview with him. He's just a really smart, down-to-earth, pragmatic guy. And I loved how he synthesized a lot of the research literature with what is actually practical for everyday people as well as athletes. And we actually have some similar backgrounds in terms of how we got into becoming scientists. Now, obviously, I'm not a professor at a university, but our journeys were similar in terms of he was a high school and collegiate hockey player and got into lifting weights and was into bodybuilding for a while and basically just wanted to get more information to learn how to get more jacked and be leaner, which I can vibe with because that's exactly why I got into scientific research, was for very selfish reasons. But he's been doing this for 20 plus years and he has a wealth of knowledge. And we covered a broad array of topics. We talk about sleep, pre-sleep nutrition. We talk about collagen supplementation and our little bit of disagreement on collagen supplementation, which I think you guys will enjoy. We also talked about nutrient timing in terms of protein, carbohydrate. Do you need carbohydrates for elite endurance exercise? And a lot of topics around athletics, competing in athletics, and how research literature from medicine can go into athletic performance and how research from athletic performance can also go into medicine. So I think you guys are going to really love this episode, and I'm excited to bring it to you. So here's my interview with Professor Mike Ormsbee. Dr. Mike Ormsbee, thanks for joining me, man. I appreciate it.
Thanks, Layne. Appreciate it.
Yeah. So first off, I think this is going to be great because we were already talking off camera for like an hour and going on and on. But I want to start with, what was your journey? Like, what led you to become a professor, to study nutrition and exercise? Did that come from like a personal interest or did you just kind of fall into it? What happened?
Yeah, I think it's like a lot of people in our lane.
Pun intended.
I was an athlete growing up and, I just was into it. Like I remember getting a weight set when I was a kid. My older brother was starting to get bigger and like get into lifting weights and stuff. And I remember going to a garage sale and picking up weights and bringing them home. And then like within, I don't know, a week later, my parents took it away because it was going to stunt my growth.
Oh man.
And so everything went away because the guy at the gym told my parents that, it would be a bad thing. And so I remember having it for about a week and loving it, and then it went away.
And how old were you?
I was probably 12.
Okay. So this is in the 90s.
Yeah. Early 90s.
Yeah.
And so they went away before we knew really better. I mean, I guess it was starting to come out around then. And then I started getting into like competitive sports, played through high school, focused on ice hockey, went to college and played ice hockey. And during that time I was always training. I just loved it, bigger, faster, stronger type mentality. And I had a mentor named Paul Arciero who taught my first ex-phys class. And I remember just sitting there and he was so energetic and so enthusiastic that it was just contagious. And I just found myself, if I wasn't reading the textbook, I was reading the old muscle magazines. If I wasn't doing that, I was training. And so I figured if I was like this into it when I didn't have to be, it was a lane for me. And so I just kept after it at that time. And I was like, I guess I'm not going to be a pro ice hockey player. And it was more like, how can I? It was very, it turned to being away from sport and more towards like bodybuilding at that time. When I was a young college male. This is kind of what we did. And I just remember thinking, I should probably try to help some other people with this. And so it was very internal. How can I improve to eventually become more helpful for others, and sort of the approach that we took. But it was all because of that. Sport, training, I've always had a sort of a drive to compete and be the best that I can possibly be. Some of it's selfish, wanting to look good and, you know, feel good. And then a lot of it now, as I get older, is transitioning to just general health. Being there for my kids, you know, being able to play and tumble with them is important to me because they're little now. And yeah, just kind of one thing led to another.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny how many parallels I get when I talk to people. Brad Schoenfeld, Stu Phillips, Jeremy Lineker.
Yeah.
You know, there's so many of these stories. Eric Helms, myself. I didn't have this great drive to help a bunch of people, although I do like doing that. It was, how can I get as jacked as possible?
For sure.
You know?
For sure.
And then when it came to grad school, it was like, well, I really like this and I don't really know what I want to do with my life. So let's just go do this. You know, there wasn't some great master plan.
In some ways, I just found that I was decent at it. You know, I liked doing it. I liked asking the questions. I was dedicated and sort of organized in a way that made me a good student. And I didn't know if I wanted to stay in it, but I was on that exercise science nutrition train and just stayed on it. Never got off.
And just to paint the picture here, in the late 90s, early 2000s, essentially what we had was the muscle magazines and some very sparse studies. I mean, there was quite a bit of endurance literature out there at the time, but kind of give people an idea of like the explosion of hypertrophy and strength research in the last 20 years.
Yeah, incredible amount. I mean, every single thing we saw at that time was like, you know, John Ivy's work and these other things in endurance, which was great. And it was also like the rise of Lance Armstrong. And those things sort of paralleled each other with how much people cared about endurance at that time and the literature that was coming out. And I feel like it wasn't until one of the first studies I was involved with was looking at the Body for Life program.
Okay.
Which was, you know, Bill Phillips put that book out in like the 1990s. There was a book called, or a VHS tape called Body of Work that accompanied it. And that like changed me. I remember reading that and just being so interested in those theories he was saying. That comes out that a lot of that stuff isn't actually backed up, but there were like some ways in which I think it was helpful. And so after reading it and being involved in those, like watching it and being entertained by it, we got the chance to run that study. I was a student in Paul Arciero's lab when we got to actually run that particular study, which changed it to looking at traditional exercise, which was like endurance, walking, be active most days of the week, along with what was the very old food guide pyramid. And we compared that to the Body for Life program, which was 3 days a week of weight training and 3 days a week of like high intensity interval training or HIIT training and a higher protein diet. And in that it was 6 meals a day. It was just two different paradigms. And we tracked them for 12 weeks. And I was just like, man, this resistance training is doing something, this high intensity. And that's the first time I took a deep dive into these other modes of exercise as opposed to just the endurance side. And that changed everything.
Again, just to paint the picture for everyone out there, there was a time when there was a debate about whether or not resistance training caused more hypertrophy than endurance training. Like this, I'm sure you've seen these studies. Like there was actual debate about this. Now, most people with eyeballs could understand what was going on, but you know, exercise in general causes an increase in lean mass, and there was I cannot explain to you how sparse the research literature on resistance training was. And I'm writing my first book now. In the intro section, I talk about why I think resistance training became a little bit of the redheaded stepchild of exercise science research because it was viewed as vanity. Like you were only building muscle to look better. Yeah. And which is weird because everyone wants to look better. Like this is like the deep, dark secret. But we put on this veil of like, well, we're doing it for health. We care about our health. Yeah. And it turns out that those goals are not necessarily in juxtaposition, that both things happen.
I'll tell you what was really cool is when I started my PhD, which was at East Carolina University, I was working with Bob Hickner there. It was early 2000s. So there was like a lot of endurance was still, maybe a little bit of resistance training was starting to come out. But our interest at that time was with my interest was with resistance training and how it affected fat metabolism, not necessarily the hypertrophy side of the equation. And so I was teed up at that time to hit a topic at a great moment. And one of the first studies we ran out of my dissertation was looking at resistance training and how it specifically changed lipolysis and fat oxidation. And we did that in lean individuals. We compared lean and obese. We looked at the adipocyte cell structure and exactly what receptors were on those different adipocytes to change lipolysis and fat oxidation. And so, to this day, we can still say we ran the first study with resistance training and how it impacted fat metabolism. And every comparator I had was to, what does endurance exercise do? What does endurance exercise do? And so that was a great moment for me where I got to actually look at what I was really passionate about, the resistance training part, and how that impacted the fat side of the equation.
Well, on that note, let's talk about some fat metabolism stuff, because I'm sure everybody would be interested to know, how does resistance training versus endurance exercise differentially impact fat metabolism? What are some takeaways we can take from that?
Yeah, I had a really cool opportunity to present on specifically resistance training and fat metabolism at NSCA a few years ago. And so I'm on stage there, and it's like, that's a hypertrophy strength type of a conference. And
right.
So I was sort of the other way. I was happy we had a decent audience show up for it. But there's so many ways. And so I think the initial way people thought about resistance training and fat metabolism was mostly from do you increase energy expenditure? Do you have this sort of afterburn? How many days longer? And there was work from Chris Melby at the time that was looking at, 24, 48, 72 hours later and still having a heightened metabolism, resting metabolism, measured with a ventilated hood.
Got it.
And so so maybe you're burning a few more calories and that might play into it. We were interested more in what was actually going on at the cellular level. And so the technique we brought into that scene was called microdialysis. Microdialysis is a technique we use all the time now. Bob Hickner brought it back to the States more or less from Sweden when he was working over there at Karolinska. And so that technique we basically pinch your skin, and then we put a needle into the skin, and then we remove the needle and leave in the skin a small flexible tubing. And so in that tubing, we can perfuse saline, and it goes into the skin, mixes with the cells, and then there's an outlet tube. And the outlet tube will give us whatever you put in, so the saline, and whatever's in the interstitial space that came out of the fat cell.
So not the same thing, but kind of like if we're looking at amino acid stuff, like AV balance sort of. You're looking at what's going into the tissue versus what's coming out.
Yes, we have like an inflow-outflow ratio we'll look at, because blood flow is really important when you're trying to measure lipolysis, because depending on what's going on, it can upregulate or downregulate what's happening. And so we would primarily look at glycerol. And glycerol, as you know, is more stable. It won't go back into the fat cell, whereas free fatty acids can.
Yeah.
And so
because it flux to the liver.
Yes, but the glycerol is a bit more stable, and so we measure that as our surrogate for lipolysis directly in the tissue. And so we'll do that primarily in the subcutaneous abdominal adipose tissue. One of our studies now, we're actually doing it in sub-Q abdominal, but also in gluteal, so like the top of your buttocks area. And we're comparing those different tissues in men and women in different states, perimenopause, postmenopause, across the board.
And just to back up, explain to our listeners why you would measure glycerol as a surrogate for lipolysis.
Yeah. So good
for
point.
For fat loss or for fat burning.
People would probably think of measuring free fatty acids to see what's circulating. And because glycerol is stable and it's the backbone to a triglyceride, right? So it's holding together these three fatty acids. And once you liberate that with some stimulus, in our case, that's exercise, hormone sensitive lipase is activated. It'll break apart glycerol from the free fatty acids, and then you can measure all these things.
Right.
And we measure it in real time in the tissue right there.
That's cool.
It's a very cool technique.
And yes, because just again, for our listeners who may not have awareness of this, in adipose tissue or fat, you store the fats as triglycerides. So as Mike was saying, a glycerol head with 3 fatty acid tails. And then as part of that, if you're going to lose body fat, one of the steps is you have to liberate that triglyceride. And so free fatty acids, when they're liberated, are less stable with what you're saying than like measuring glycerol. So if you're having an increase in glycerol, by proxy, you're assuming that there's an increase in lipolysis, correct?
Correct. Yeah, and we'll measure free fatty acids and glycerol, but glycerol is the one we sort of tag it to most often. And so with this technique, we can actually see with resistance training, back to the original question, in an acute way, training, we get an increase in lipolysis. So now, 20 years later, like Yeah, that's what you'd expect. Like,
Everybody knows that, yeah.
Well, yeah, we ran that first study and it was really neat. And then we compared if you're lean and trained or lean and sedentary versus overweight or obese. And so it turned out like the response you have, everybody sort of has this increase in lipolysis from the training and oxidation, depending on if you've eaten or not recently. But the obese individuals just have a much lower response. It's just blunted at every time point with any stimulus to the lipolytic response. And that's probably something to do with the receptor numbers for alpha and beta on the actual adipocyte. If you're interested, so like alpha and beta are on the cell,
right?
And so you have basically like an accelerator and a brake on lipolysis. And
which one's the accelerator? Which one's the brake?
Yeah, so you'll have beta accelerating lipolysis and alpha braking lipolysis. And so once you exercise, you'll like liberate, let's say, or produce epinephrine and norepinephrine as a response. Those will attach to those receptors, and the number of receptors on the cell will more or less dictate the outcome. So if you have a lot more alphas, you probably will have a blunted lipolytic response. And if you have a lot more beta, you probably have a heightened lipolytic response, putting those into the interstitial space, eventually the blood, and hopefully oxidizing them at the end of the day. So yeah, several different things to unpack there, but the basic take home was that the training for the first time increased lipolysis. So we were able to show in a very acute setting that was happening. So that's kind of the background to it, but like, mechanisms don't always equal outcomes.
That was going to be my next question for you, because so I think some people listening to this would say, well, that means if you already have excess body fat, it's harder to lose body fat. But if we look at the outcome studies, people who are obese or who have type 2 diabetes, if we put them under the same level of caloric restriction, same exercise program, on average, they lose the same amount of body fat. So how do we reconcile those two things? Do you have any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think part of that's starting point. Where are you with how far out of homeostasis are you from what your body sort of wants? I think if you're starting at this higher point of a ton of excess adiposity, the momentum to lose that in a caloric deficit is probably greater at that point. So that's probably swaying it quite a bit. And just because it's harder in some of the tissues, we're measuring specifically abdominal. We don't know about the other depots. We haven't put those probes every single location. The most common places we put them are abdominal and gluteal.
I see.
And so there's plenty other places you can be pulling fat from. Those are just where we can get a probe fairly easily in human beings.
Yeah. So I'm going to do something I don't usually do with a guest, but I'm going to tell you an opinion I have, and I would love for you to poke holes in it if you see holes, because you are more of an expert on this topic than I am. But I think a lot of people conflate lipolysis, fat oxidation with actual loss of body fat.
No doubt.
And this can get into low carb versus low fat diets, what type of exercise you do to maximize fat burning. What I tell people is you are always storing fat and you're always burning fat. And both things are happening at the same time. It's the relative rates of each that are going to determine the overall rate of fat loss. Now, if you're insulin insensitive, you may not be burning as much fat, but you're probably not storing as much fat either, because the storage receptors for insulin to hook up to are also insensitive. And so what's probably happening is you just have less turnover overall, is my guess. I haven't looked into that research literature. And then if we look at like low carb versus low fat or different types of exercise, if you're on a low carb diet, insulin's low, you're not consuming much carbohydrate, so you're going to burn more fat. But we also know from tracer studies that most of the fat that gets stored in adipose is from fat. It's not from carbohydrate. I think it's like over 98% in a mixed diet. So you're burning a lot of fat, but you're storing a lot of fat. If you're on a high carb diet, low fat, assume equal calories, you're not burning much fat, but you're also not storing much fat. And so what ends up driving it still is caloric balance. Now, I would love to get your take on my opinion on that and poke holes in it if you see holes.
Actually, I agree with it. There's a lot of things that are very right about that statement. In our studies that we were just describing, they were exercise-only studies, not dietary influence. Sure. So I can't give you a for sure on that, but the flux is certainly happening.
Did you guys standardize a meal beforehand, or was it fasted?
Sure, yeah. The initial measurements and then we measured lipolysis for a very long period of time.
Yeah.
The whole day.
Yeah.
And so they were fasted for the workout. And then we had to give them a meal at some point or they wouldn't do our study. So we gave them an identical meal, and then we followed them. And then we followed them overnight into the next day, which partially got me into other work we do with pre-sleep feeding and different areas. But in terms of lipolysis and fat ox, they're always conflated. And we often see increases in lipolysis that may or may not match oxidation. And a lot of that depends on your state.
Right.
Did you eat? Did you not? Are you exercise? Are you not? What type of exercise did you do? Are you resting, et cetera? And so the trouble with a lot of our data is you see a great curve. It's beautiful, but you're not eating, and that's not real.
Right.
Yeah. And you're probably going to eat before you work out. Right.
Yeah.
And so all of this changes. And so a lot of times in our lab, we have to craft a study to show, to try to find an answer, but it's not always what they say ecologically valid, like something people would do. And so then I have to turn to our other types of studies where it's maybe we don't have as cool of a curve from a lipolytic standpoint, but we actually measure body composition over time.
Yep.
And so going back to even that very first study that we were talking about with Body for Life versus the American Heart Association sort of guidelines from way a long time ago, at the end of that time, people improved body composition, lost weight, and had better, bigger health metric outcomes.
In the Body for Life.
Well, they all had improvements.
Right.
But the benefits were statistically significantly greater with adding the higher protein diet, resistance training, and high intensity interval training. And so in my mind, once you see resistance training in the mix, you inherently have a better outcome at the end of a real study in real people over a real amount of time.
Many people ask me what supplements I take, and that's easy. I take the supplements that I formulate and created for my supplement line, Outwork Nutrition. You see, I started Outwork Nutrition because I was frustrated by the lack of transparency in the supplement industry. So many companies were using proprietary blends to hide the fact that they were drastically underdosing their products. And as a research nutrition scientist, I know what having a proper dosage means when it comes to these ingredients. And I knew that many of these companies were just ripping people off. That's when I decided to create my own line of science-based supplements that were good enough to support my training. As someone who has won 5 national titles and 2 world titles in powerlifting and set 2 world records in powerlifting and trains for 2 to 3 hours a day, I needed supplements that would support my hard, intense training and recovery. All Outwork Nutrition products are based on the latest scientific evidence, and every ingredient is included at the proper clinical dose for maximum effectiveness. We provide links to all the scientific research and ingredients and claims on our website, so you don't have to take our word for it. You can read it for yourself. No proprietary blends, no BS marketing hype, no empty promises. Just science-backed supplements to support your hard work. Click the link in the show notes or head on over to outworknutrition.com and sign up for our email list to get 10% off your first order. That is exactly how I would frame it. And I think I want to point out a few things you said, because I try to educate my audience about study design and, so many comments, I guess, why was there only 12 people in this study? Or why was it? Okay, I want you to just put yourself in these people's shoes, right? So they've got like stuff in their abdomen, right? Or their buttocks, and they're keeping it there for a full day based on what you're saying.
Yeah.
They're exercising fasted. And here's the other thing about one of the reasons we do a lot of fasted research. It's because it's a steady state.
Yeah.
Okay. And especially if you're trying to do metabolic tracer work with like protein metabolism. I mean, I don't know if you saw the study that came out of Luc Van Loon's lab looking at like 0, 25, or 100 grams of protein. They were in a supine position for 12 hours.
Yeah.
Like I look at that study and the people are like, well, they only had this number of people. I'm like, that's because you can't.
Yeah.
Who's going to be like, okay, I'll exercise, have this shake, lay down for 12 hours while you take chunks of my flesh out of me. Like good luck. You know what I mean?
But you have to be like skilled enough to see that in the paper,
right,
and read the thing. I mean, even if we go to like some of our other work in performance, like performance nutrition, not necessarily like body comp, weight loss, diabetes type of work. If you don't get to the methods section and understand exactly what they did, you might interpret it as, hey, we should do this or we shouldn't do this. But like you said, does it make sense in the context of you do this, lay down for 12 hours, and then do some type of performance, which you would never actually do,
right,
as an outcome?
And so as researchers, we are trying to stitch these things together because cohort data or free living data is great because you can get a lot of people and you have outcomes. But outcomes have to be supported by mechanisms. And so what we're trying to do with a study like what you're describing is, okay, what's the mechanism behind this? Can we come up with anything that makes sense? And I'll always tell people, really, you want to see kind of this nice symphony that comes out, right? You want to see, okay, on an epidemiological level, we see something here. If we do, there's some mechanism that we propose that explains this. And then if we do a randomized control trial, all those three things kind of line up. And that is when we have really good confidence that we trust data, right? At least for me, when those things line up. And I'll just use the example of creatine, right? We have a multitude of mechanisms that are plausible. You don't really need, I guess, an epidemiology study, but I'm guessing if we polled people who took creatine, they're probably more muscular than people who don't, but confounding variables, they also lift. But then if we do the randomized control trials, we see all this stuff line up and we see it thousands of times, feel very confident in it. But it doesn't always come out that cleanly sometimes. And you can find mechanistic data that would suggest something like, we might, just from the study you were describing, might say, well, it's going to be harder for obese people to lose weight from exercise because of this fat metabolism thing. But then if we do the RCTs, we see, oh no, it's actually not.
Totally agree. And I think one of the coolest things I've ever heard was I was looking through a mechanistic paper and changes in mTOR and PPAR game, all these different things that could be added. And someone said those mechanistic protein markers don't win gold medals.
Yeah. What I tell people, as somebody who's coached over 2,000 people in my life, who has talked to God, answered emails from, it's got to be tens of thousands of people. I tell people scientific experiments are big, blunt instruments, okay? Because of how constrained you have to be to control for confounding variables, it limits the applicability of the studies. And so really, again, really robust data, you'll see it kind of play out across a lot of different populations, a lot of different age groups. If it's robust, it tends to work in most situations. And coaching is an art form. I tell people scientific experiments will tell you what not to do more often than will instruct you what to do. Okay. And I think so much of this boils down to, like with athletics, is adherence, getting somebody bought in. Like placebo is real. And I placebo clients all the time. Like if they ask me about it, I'll be honest, but I'll say like, there's no magic to this, but like sometimes I'll change things just to change things just because somebody will get more excited. I mean, I know when I, get a new powerlifting block from my coach, even though I know like, well, it's really not magic. This is about force production and mechanical tension over time. I still get excited, right? Those things matter. And that's where good coaches, I think it's important to have an understanding of science, of course, because otherwise you waste time doing things that probably aren't productive. You spend time on the wrong things. But I think good coaches at their core are just really good leaders. They are good communicators, and they understand how to get people to buy in. And those things are a lot more important than like minute scientific X's and O's. And I'll just give one more comparison, and I'll let you give your take on it, because I'm sure you've worked with a lot of athletes and talked to a lot of coaches. So many times people will bring me like videos of pro bodybuilders. Look at the way this guy trains. How does he? Yeah. And I'm like, and take the steroids out of it. At the top level, they're all on steroids and they're all using similar amounts of stuff. So just take that out of it. And they all have great genetics. Here's why all these different training methods work well. Take Phil Heath. He's using mostly machines. Ronnie Coleman using massive amounts of weights, doing high volume. Dorian Yates, relatively low volume. Okay, here's the one common thing. They trained really hard for decades.
No doubt.
And when people talk about genetics and stuff, I go, well, did you train really hard for 10 years consistently without any breaks? And most people can't say that.
Yeah, I mean, that training piece in everything we do is the biggest lever to pull. And the nutrition is great. And I'm a full-fledged believer, but it is definitely the icing on top of that resistance trained cake.
Absolutely. Stu Phillips and I talked about this. Brad Schoenfeld and I talked about this. We're talking about this. I have a PhD in nutrition. I love nutrition. I love protein. And I remember reading muscle magazines. I'm sure you did too, where it's nutrition is even more important than training. No. Doing the thing is the most important thing. Like you can get by with a lot. Will you ever get to an elite status if you're not dialing in all these things? Probably not. But if you train really hard, it washes out a lot of mistakes in other areas.
You know, I heard someone say recently that exercise training is your biological apology to your lifestyle.
There was just that paper that was published on, did you see this, on alcohol intake and mortality and exercise? And just for the TLDR for everyone out there, basically alcohol intake for mortality didn't really matter if you were really, really fit. If you had in the highest quartile of, I think it was quartile of VO2 max. Yeah. Now that doesn't mean that alcohol is innocuous. And of course, this is cohort data. There's confounding variable potential. But I think what we can say is that if you're really fit, you can get away with a lot more than people who are not.
I was excited to see that because a student in my lab right now.
Because you like beer like me?
I like cold beer. This guy named Brett Cross, he's a PhD student in our lab. He is looking at this, but not from an alcohol take. It's from an acute sleep deprivation take. And so what we're seeing is, does aerobic fitness, this is specifically aerobic fitness, protect against acute sleep deprivation? And so it is a great model where for 3 nights in a row, you're getting 30% less sleep each night. And then we're looking at cardiovascular outcomes, performance outcomes, cognitive outcomes, and seeing if your fitness level actually helps save some of the decline you're probably going to see from that acute sleep debt.
And when you say decline, you said cognitive and physical performance, right?
And cardiac.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
So looking at like aortic stiffness and pulse weight.
Oh, really? So even with a few nights of sleep deprivation, you can see differences in aortic stiffness?
Yes.
Really?
Yeah, even one.
So that's probably, I'm just thinking about this in folks, like cardiovascular disease is something that happens over the course of decades, but a heart attack is an acute thing, right? And there can be different things to precipitate a heart attack. Obviously, you have to have a necessary amount of blockage for that to happen. But if you have more or aortic stiffness or arterial stiffness, if you have excess alcohol intake, which can affect heart rhythm, those are probably short-term acute possible triggers, correct?
For sure.
Yeah.
For sure. And because they're all changing, like inflammation, the stiffness of the vessels, and all that stuff's pretty acute. And you have this like perfect storm where if you have all those things together, but back to like what's fitness doing, we know, at least in this case, we're studying how the aerobic fitness may or may not rescue. And I think that we're going to have some cool data coming out soon.
Can you tell us about it, or you got to be quiet?
I can't talk about what the outcomes are, but I'll tell you, it's looking favorable for fitness.
Yeah. And that's not surprising across pretty much anything. And I want to touch on sleep because you have a lot of really good research on this. But before we get to that, I think it's important to point out this kind of takes us into the concept of risk, which I think a lot of people misunderstand, and I think it's important to understand. Because I hear from so many people who may follow like a wonky diet that, you know, the data would say is not, I'll just be like carnivore diet, for example, right? And it's like, well, I had my calcium score done, it was 0. Or I did, and it's like, when you talk about things like for example, LDL cholesterol, it is, in my opinion, an independent risk factor for cardiovascular disease, but it's not the only risk factor. And there are other things at play here. And it's like when people say, I knew somebody who smoked every day for 50 years and never had a heart attack, never got lung cancer. Okay, well, there are people who don't wear their seatbelts, who get in car crashes, who survive. And there are people who wear their seatbelt and it kills them. But if you're doing the math on probability, you're wearing your seatbelt. And so I think what people need to understand is that you can have competing risk factors, you can have competing mechanisms, and when we talk about research data, we are talking about a spread of probabilities, not you do this thing and X is absolutely going to happen.
No doubt. I mean, I think recently I was looking at a paper that was looking at variety of exercise, not just length or duration of exercise in a week, for example. And like the more varied your exercises were, you had something like a 19% reduction in all-cause mortality. Well, that's great, but like you could also get hit by a bus tomorrow. But it does show that I should probably just do varied exercises that might help me out. And for me, whether it's exercise, supplements, or any lifestyle intervention, if it's not going to hurt me and it might help me, I'm probably going to take the approach of doing it.
Right.
And so if I see that data and I really want to work through it, I'm going to probably try to mix it up a little bit in what I'm doing personally.
Okay. So you've touched on sleep a couple times. I know you have some research data regarding sleep, regarding pre-sleep nutrition. First off, how did you get into that? And then what are some of your big takeaways from the research you've done so far? Yeah,
the pre-sleep feeding's probably what we're most well known for better or worse. It's just been a lane that we were really interested in. It was actually my first study that I ran when I was a brand new assistant professor at Florida State University. And the reason it happened was I like to ask questions that I see in my daily life. And I like to also ask questions that will impact other people. For me, a scientist can ask a certain question that would be beneficial to a small group, or you can just sort of reframe what that question means and how it might impact a broader audience. For example, if I'm going over to athletics, if I bring a question, say, I want to do this, this, and this, and you're the coach, you'll be like, I don't care about any of that. So I need to ask better questions or get input from the people who actually have those questions. So I'd say, for your team, what are you looking for? Like, what's something you have a question I can help answer? Our group can get on. And with the pre-sleep feeding area, it was sort of that way. I was, as an athlete, I ate late at night. Didn't see a problem. Never heard about it being a problem. I was just hungry. Then I started looking around, and I had a bunch of bodybuilding friends at the time, and they were not only eating late, but they would purposely wake up and eat. And so that changed,
I did this for a while.
Changed it as well, right? It's like it was common culture for a long time, and it still is in many circles. And then I remember seeing people say, "Oh, don't eat at this time." It started out like from like The Biggest Loser in these older shows, were like, "Stop eating, don't eat after 6 p.m., don't eat after 7," and it got a complete cutoff. And I still see it to this day, where different trackable wearable companies or people that have like anything to do with sleep in wearable tech or techs will actually come and say, don't eat after this time. But there are so many nuances, Layne, to this that it makes it quite hard. If you work with athletes, like high level athletes, what time of day do most professional athletes compete?
Usually in prime time.
In
the evening.
Late at night. And then they also have to likely either play again the next day or train again the next day. And if you don't eat late at night, you're going to have a problem. You can't recover. You can't get to a place where you can compete again and be at the highest level. You see this sort of stair-step response where you start here and you sort of come down a little bit after a game or a practice or whatever training it is. And then if you don't refuel, you just continue to stair-step down in your physiological responses to it. So this whole mix was going on, and I was like, you know what? Let me look at the literature because I'm interested. I like to eat at night. What is it?
Same.
But we ate very specific things. I remember sitting around with my friends and we were having like egg sandwiches or scrambled eggs or yogurt or cottage cheese or a protein shake. Like it wasn't a giant, another mixed meal that was huge.
Right.
It was very specific. We didn't know we were doing it. That was just kind of what we gravitated towards. And so anyway, started looking at the literature, and there was like nothing in the lane of eating a reasonable protein dominant food before bed. It was all large mixed meals, people with nighttime eating syndrome, which is where you eat like a majority of your calories late at night, or people who were shift workers. And so they were, people who would like work all night, and most of their food was coming from vending machines. It was like a totally different scenario.
Yep.
In those cases, it was metabolically an issue, and it showed time and time again. And so getting into that literature, we're like, where did this start? And so like 1993, I remember reading the first study by Roman, and Roman looked at a 544 calorie mixed meal taken at 3 different times of the day. And so in this scenario, if you had that same meal in the morning, in the middle of the day, or at night, you had a large difference in how your just simple thermic effect of food responded to that meal. And it got worse. The morning, you had a nice, robust response. It got blunted in the later afternoon, and it got really blunted late at night. All right, so then 10 years later, another study came out from DeCastro's group, and they looked at how do you feel in terms of satiation and desire to eat. And those, not the exact time, but very similar time frames, morning, afternoon, or night, The late night, you're more hungry, you're less satiated. So that's like the perfect combination to overeat and have the wrong things at that time of night. And so I think that's where it was all born from. And people are like, yeah, don't do it. You shouldn't do it. And even now, when you look at like the circadian rhythm researchers who look at large mixed meals and it sort of mistimes your circadian rhythm, the outcomes are not great. They don't look very good. But again, it's a different context. One, it's not athletes. Two, I think there's a place for this in regular folks. Mm-hmm. And in our country, where I actually think we are not over-proteined, that you have just another opportunity to feed, and particularly a protein-dominant source. And so that got us into it.
And you're going however long without stimulating muscle protein synthesis. If you're an athlete or care about recovery, those sorts of things, and as you're saying this, I'm like, well, this, we got to be careful here because I like to eat at night. This does not fit my bias, Well, therefore, it's all BS,
Well, that's what we did. We designed this study right out of the gate, and we did it super simple. We just looked at carbohydrates in a shake. So it was all powders that you added water to and shook up. And then we looked at casein because we all thought casein was the one to have at night because it was we had heard it was a slow release forever. And we compared it to whey. So it was very simple. Go home, have your shake, come back the next day. And then we sort of monitor metabolic rate the next morning and look at a couple of biomarkers. Very simple, but a ton of problems. And so we found problems all over the place. Our reviewers are like, well, how did they sleep? I'm like, well, I didn't think about measuring that. I was looking at metabolism. Right. And then it was like, did they actually drink the shake? I'm like, well, I told them to. I hope they did. They said they did. And so we saw these nuances come out of those first 8 years of work, looking at men and women, lean and obese, old and young, all different cohorts. We were trying to answer the same question over and over and over. So like, as you said earlier, does it stand up to repeated trials in different groups and different scenarios over and over and over? And so what we found at basically the conclusion of all of that piece was that the protein groups in the next morning had a higher revving metabolic rate than having nothing. And so we were concluding at the time that, all right, that's kind of neat. I guess we didn't measure it overnight. We measured the next morning. So maybe it's high all night. Maybe that's an opportunity to sort of burn a few more calories all through the night.
And that was their resting energy expenditure?
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, they're just resting energy expenditure. So yeah, real basic. But then we're like, we should probably know what's going on through the night. We should probably know if they're actually eating it. So then we created these sleep-in studies where they were sleeping in the lab. And we put those microdialysis probes in their belly. We're looking at fat metabolism all night. Then through various studies, we started layering technologies on where you have like CGMs now and the microdialysis probes. And we can see what's happening to your hormones. Does it change growth hormone release? Does it change insulin? Does it change glucose? In all of those different studies, there was one time when we saw an outcome that was not favorable. This was when we had women who were overweight or obese, and they took a pre-sleep shake. They were sedentary. And no matter what they had, carbs or the proteins, their morning blood glucose was slightly elevated, as was their insulin. And so, okay, that's not really what we're looking for. And so we took those same women, we gave them just 2 days a week of basic exercise, and that went away entirely.
Yeah, like you said,
so
goes out
exercise
the wash
became a massive hammer for that problem. So exercise, again, king. And we added those other layers on because we were interested in fat metabolism again. Everyone said you would gain fat if you have something before bed. And so we wanted to answer that question. We've done that several times now where I'll never forget it. My doc student came running in and she's like, nothing happened. They had this before bed. There was no difference. I'm totally screwed here, And I was like, well,
not the null hypothesis. No.
But like in our field, you can say things, and it's great to publish things so that if something does or doesn't work. And so if we just flip it, it simply gives people an opportunity to have a protein. And I'll define how we did it, but a protein dominant food or shake before bed if they want it, and it does not change lipolysis. Or fat oxidation in an acute setting. So in that sense, from our view on fat metabolism, there was no change going on whatsoever.
You know, guys, training is infinitely more complicated than nutrition. Where do you start? How many reps? How many sets? How close to failure? If you're confused about where to start with training, but you don't have the money to hire a coach to expertly guide you, check out the Layne Workout Builder. When you subscribe to the Layne Workout Builder, you get access to all my evidence-based programming. We have programs for every experience level, goal, and equipment availability. We even have programs for people with essentially no equipment and home gyms or hotel gyms or garage gyms, all the way up to fully equipped commercial gyms. We take all the guesswork out of the reps, sets, and intensity, but give you the flexibility to pick exercises that you prefer and have access to, while still making sure that the exercises that you may sub in are equally effective for building muscle. So if you're ready to take the guesswork out of your training, get strong, and build muscle, click the link in the show notes and sign up to the Layne Workout Builder today.
I think we should define pre-sleep feeding the way we did it. So it was 2 hours after dinner and 30 minutes before bed.
Okay.
And most of the time we're talking about a shake. One time we used cottage cheese. One time we used chocolate milk. We've done some iterations of it, but usually it's a liquid or a semi-solid that we've been able to do from our research so far. And we're still not done with it. There's nuances. There's new proteins that we're trying now. Now the big thing is stacking, almost like a pre-workout, but it's like a pre-sleep where it's a protein plus a whole bunch of sleep ingredients. Mm-hmm. So we're trying to look at this mix. We're trying to see if there's a calorie threshold, because we're only feeding like 150 to 200 calories. Mm-hmm. It's like 40 grams of protein.
Very small, yeah.
And that's it. Maybe a little bit other with it, but that's it.
For the average person listening to this, who's just going to say, well, what should I eat before bed?
Yeah.
Right? Like, we're just thinking. Obviously, like, this is a very complicated topic that we could go a bunch of different ways with. But do you have any like general advice for people for pre-sleep nutrition for just the average person who wants to get healthy? And then I'm going to ask you a follow-up question about athletes. But
okay,
for the average person.
I think for the average person, the best way to view it is that it won't hurt you and it might help you. So that's like the general context. It's a wonderful way. You're at home. You have access to foods to get your total daily protein up to a level that you might want. Let's say you've missed during the day, you're a little bit low. It's one more feeding opportunity to hit your daily protein intake, which is great. And then the food you should go for are low calorie, high protein. And so we've only tested some iterations of that. Most of those are protein shakes. And again, in this case, now we know it doesn't matter casein, whey, plant-based, whatever, as long as you get the right combo in. And they're usually less than 200 calories. So half a cup to a cup of cottage cheese. We've tested that. The protein shakes we've tested. I would theorize that something like the eggs were a good idea. Mm-hmm. We have not tested that, but I would assume it would go along with the others. And it's not magical. It's nothing magical at all. It is just simply another time to feed.
Right.
We can get into outcomes outside of body comp if you want, because there are some performance implications that are really neat as well.
Yeah, I'd love for you to pontificate on that. And also, did you look at like sleep quality, those sorts of things? Was any of that impacted by pre-sleep nutrition? Yeah.
So let's talk about the performance aspect first, because that came online. So for a long time, it was just our lab and Luke Van Loon's lab doing this work in pre-sleep feeding. Mm-hmm. Now it's awesome because there's so much new data coming out all the time from different labs. So it really helps us to sort of accelerate what we're learning about this particular area. When the performance aspects come into place, the most popular one that gets traction is in professional soccer players. And when they had an evening match and then took protein after the match, they recovered and came back to normal from being damaged from the match in almost every marker from having pre-sleep protein.
And so you're looking at things like creatine kinase or
what, some of the biomarkers were creatine kinase, some of the inflammatory markers like IL-6 and these. And then the other part of that is like counter movement jump, reactive strength index, all came back to normal faster.
That's great, because those for those listening, when we talk about recovery from exercise, the hardest endpoint I would say is how long does it take you to go from performing at your best to recover from that to get back to where you can perform at your best again?
Yeah.
And things like counter movement jump, 1 rep max strength, those are hard endpoints. So if you look at the markers and then you look at the endpoints and those line up, you can feel really good about it. So what you're saying is when they had protein before bed compared to nothing,
you're right,
they recovered faster, were able to get back to performing optimally at a faster rate compared to those who didn't have protein before bed.
Yep. And that's some of the things we've battled with for a long time with design is what should they compare it to?
Yeah.
Should it be compared to nothing? Should it be compared to carbohydrate?
Mm-hmm.
And so we've done some of those comparisons over time, depending on the outcomes. And I tell you, no matter which way we design it, some reviewer hammers us because we did it wrong.
Yeah, sure.
But we try to keep morphing and learning from what we've done wrong because we've made a lot of mistakes, and sleep was one of those. And so in the beginning, we didn't measure sleep at all. I wasn't thinking about it. I was more along performance and recovery and metabolism. And then we had reviewer comments come back like, what's going on with sleep? So we started adding the early days just a questionnaire. It was like, how many hours did you sleep? How did it feel? Was it normal, not normal, whatever? And then we got into better questionnaires. And then we got into wearables. And so it finally got to the point where about 3 years ago, one of my students at the time, Kieran Patterson, designed a study to look at how pre-sleep feeding specifically impacted sleep as the primary endpoint, as opposed to further down the line, we just kind of basically look at it. It was like the primary outcome from that. And then in that study, we also looked at a newer supplement called alpha-lactalbumin, which is a protein derivative found in like mother's milk and cow's milk. And it's been fractionated and isolated for a very long time and put into infant formula because it's high in tryptophan.
Yep.
And so they've now, they knew that, but it finally got put into like an adult supplement so that, and it was marketed for pre-sleep. So we were looking at that product versus the traditional ways and casings that we typically give. And so finally now we're looking at sleep, and as you find many times in our lab, time and time again, no findings. It didn't change sleep. It didn't improve sleep. It didn't make it worse. And so I just can't stand seeing online when like your sleep's totally messed up. And it's like, well, what was it? How big was it? Was it a mixed meal? Did you exercise any time in close proximity to that? There's so many just different nuances that come into play. But in our hands and other people's, a small protein drink before bed actually improves sleep latency. Not changes it, not gets it wrong. I mean, and this is an athlete data too. Like it's and I've had, this is all anecdotal, but I love getting notes from people that are like, I've listened to something you said, I incorporated this. I went from not sleeping to being able to sleep like a baby because I simply was hungry and wouldn't eat. And now I have a little bit of food. I'm not hungry. I don't wake up. But like, pretty nice. I'd say a couple things for your listener that are important. If you're doing this with a protein shake, maybe don't fill that protein shake up all the way with water. Yeah. Because you then probably have to get up and urinate in the middle of the night. Like you can put less water in there and still have a nice shake if you're doing it that way. But so that's one of the caveats. And if you don't like it, or if you find it keeps you up, don't do it. Yeah. You don't have to do it. It's just a strategy, another tool for you to potentially use.
You mentioned trackables, wearables. I see good things with these and I see bad things with these. Yeah. How accurate are they for actually looking at sleep? How accurate are they for establishing recovery? So they'll tell you like, well, your HRV is this, you're primed to go versus, oh, this is going to be a crap day. Yeah. Because I have my own thoughts about this, but I'd love to hear your take on wearables.
Yeah, they're real interesting, right? So we got into this in 2020 when our lab shut down with the COVID epidemic. And so we couldn't do anything that was like real time. So we're like, we got to shift. So at that point, we got lined up and got a grant from Whoop. And we started looking at athletes remotely by their watches. And we got watches on as many athletes as we could, 4 universities, all female athletes, and we just started tracking everything. What can we actually track from this? And we're excited about it because there were like a lot of different metrics you're getting. But again, not only with Whoop, but many of the other companies we work, there's a ton of them. There's some metrics we can't even report that are coming from it because they're just so all over the place. They make no sense at all. And others are pretty good. And so I think if you use the technology enough and you're tracking day to day, you're probably getting something close to like what's your normal, but it might not be accurate or like really valid, but it's following and tracking you okay. So you can tell if you're lower or higher, let's say from the previous day, but you have no idea if that's spot on. And some of these companies are really good at one thing and some are trying to be good at like a million things. And it becomes hard to tease out what's right. For example, the sleep staging, we can't even use on most of the technology. So are you a non-REM, REM stage 1? We can't use any of it. What we can use is how long were you in bed, how long did it take you to fall asleep, which is a little bit better. Sleep efficiency, consistency, which is massive. What time do you go to bed and what time do you wake up is really important. And so we use it for those reasons. But there's a reason every next study we do tries a new technology.
Yeah.
And we keep changing technology or adding one so that we can see if something's better than another. So we've done the wrist worn, we've done chest worn, we've done head straps now for sleep and tracking, and we're getting into some of the ring devices now to look at various ways you can measure sleep and activity and all of it.
Yeah, I saw a study that came out that basically the take home was your subjective how you feel after a night of sleep is actually pretty much better or just as good as or probably better than whatever a wearable tells you.
Well, I tell you, there's sometimes a problem with too much data as well.
Yeah.
And so I got some of these devices. I usually get to trial them. And at the time, I had very little children. And the sleep every day was horrible. And it told me never to train. I'm like, well, I have to train sometime. And I ended up taking them off because if you're like me, like I love the data, but I can get too much into it and like have to meet certain things and get crazy about it. I took it off because I didn't want to know it was bad. And I only had this certain time to actually train. So that's what I ended up doing. And so I know some athletes and teams are doing that now too, where it's like, if you're my star player and you wake up for whatever reason, it tells you you're in the red. Now, are you totally mentally screwed up here that you don't want to play the game or you don't think you're going to be as good as you are? And I need you to think you're the best ever. So for that reason, we use them sparingly.
So this has been one of the problems I've noticed with wearables, especially with people who have kind of more like obsessive compulsive tendencies. It's like a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? What I can tell you is I have an 8 sleep bed that will track my sleep. I don't know how accurate it is. I've also worn my Apple Watch before, track my sleep, don't know how accurate it is. I think what I can say is similar to what you said. It says I was a little bit more consistent with my sleep, wasn't moving as much. It may not get the actual hard numbers right, but compared to the average, it's probably, there's the relative, it's like the difference in accuracy and precision, right?
For sure.
But when I get that data, I don't go, oh man, I only slept 5 hours last night and it says I have a score of 60. I'm not going to have my heavy training session today. No, I will tell you here's an anecdote for you. My personal best 10 rep squat, 535 pounds back in 2015 was after a night where I traveled to Las Vegas because I was promoting a powerlifting meet there. And I got no sleep that night. For whatever reason, I was wired, couldn't get to bed, had like literally 0 minutes of sleep, went in and absolutely crushed. And all things being equal, do I think it would have been better if I'd had some sleep? Yeah. But you don't know. Like the actual endpoint that matters is how do you perform? Now, I'm not saying if you feel like absolute dog crap to go in and train. Of course, you can take a day off here and there. Some elite athletes, they can't afford to do that. And if you sleep like crap the night before a competition, which has happened to me too, you can't afford to just be like, hey, can we like move the competition back a couple days? Like you can't do that. And again, like I slept 3 hours the night before 2019 Nationals and pulled my best ever deadlift at 2019 Nationals. Well, at the time, my best ever deadlift. And what I told myself was, you've been sleeping great all week. You feel good. You feel recovered. One night is not going to ruin it. So I want you to speak to that because my feeling on sleep is this goes into the overall recovery bucket, which also goes into how has your programming been, which also feeds into psychological stress because that matters for recovery. And also, what has it looked like for weeks on end? My personal opinion is that what you have been doing for sleep over the course of the last month is much more important than what happened just the night before.
Yeah.
And you could get a great amount of sleep, but I can tell you, like, if I've been consistently sleeping like 5 or 6 hours and then I get a night where I get 8, a lot of times I feel worse after the night where I get a lot of sleep. So those are just anecdotes, and I am not a sleep expert by any stretch of the imagination. So I would love to hear how that fits with the research data.
Yeah, I'll share several stories around that. So years ago, we ran this study that we're still trying to get published, which was looking at sleep the 3 nights before a soccer match. And this was an FSU athletes, which was really cool to use that level. And a lot of times, you described it, like maybe you're nervous for the match the night before.
Sure.
Sometimes you don't sleep well. And it turned out that the nights 2 and -1 was a problem. -2 days before, if you slept well there, or -3, all impacted your performance. And we measured that by attempted and completed pass rates, how many shots on goal did you take, the speed and velocity of what you were kicking. Like all of that stuff mattered more the 2 and 3 days before than just the first day, than like the most immediate day before. So like that is one context. The next one I'll tell you, we're looking at cross-country runners and performance in sleep, and that's in review now as well, where it mattered. We went back a week, but 7 days before was still influencing your running performance. And so you're right. It's moving. We haven't gone back a month, but we went back 7 days. And so that far out, you should be thinking about consistency and time you're in bed, time you're awake, the sleep routines and all that. And so the data are panning out. And so we have 2 studies that are showing that already at this point. Your other comment was around if you have like a makeup day. And so I guess that there was a review paper that came out recently on this topic. And it was looking at acute sleep deprivation. How do you respond to lower sleep over a consistent period of time? Should you make it up if you have this sleep debt and like sleep in on a Saturday, for example? And so there's like 2 competing thoughts that I think we can reconcile and make work together. But the one is that consistency is the most important. A set sleep time to go to bed and a set wake time, particularly the wake time. Having those dialed in really help. If you're real sporadic, like you're a college student and like one morning you're up at 6 to get to an early class and one morning you're sleeping till 10, and it's back and forth, people would say it's like the equivalent of flying to LA and back every day. Every day your body's just going through it. You're like forcing this disruption. And so in that context, consistency is absolutely critical, but there's a caveat, which is repaying the sleep debt. And again, this is just from a review paper that I recently went through, but it's looking like, even though consistency is key, if you are in the negative and you know it, it's probably worth sleeping in on that Saturday, because even though that changes your consistency, that's a net more positive than being chronically low and needing to replace that sleep debt. So that's sort of the state of what that looks like.
Yeah. So somebody in a long distance relationship who flies out to Arizona every other week, I'm like, I get there and she's a night owl, so it's like, oh man, this is tough, right? Because usually what'll happen is my kids, I got to get up at, 6:30 to get my kids to school on time. Well, that's, 4:30,
right.
Her time when I go out there. And I do see this where it's like, I think my body has adjusted to it a little bit over time, but there's like a lag time, especially the first couple days I'm out there. And then the first couple days I'm back, you know?
It makes total sense. In fact, what was really neat is we had a student last year named Tim Grice that was looking at performance and travel time. So like now the ACC schools have games on the West Coast.
Yeah.
That's a thing. So Tim traveled with our softball team. And so he was able to capture data at home in our home match, and then 2 trips to the West. And one of those trips, they kept East Coast time. And the other trip, they switched to West Coast time. And so he was trying to tease out, like, what do you tell the athletes to do? Do you try to change their time? Do you try to keep them on East Coast time, which is hard, by the way. So they had to do like artificial lights to get them up at different times and try to get things in their face, sunlight in their face. And then at the other time of the day to try to get them to bed super early on the West Coast, which is a challenge, especially with the team setting. It might work better for like individual sports where you're just controlling yourself, but team setting changes it a lot. The bottom line from that study was like, we probably didn't cross enough time zones. It was only to the West Coast. If it was further, it probably would have made more sense. But at the end of the day, there was like very, very minor improvements for keeping East Coast time, but nothing that you would, I wouldn't necessarily implement them because they were such a disruptor to your life.
Yeah.
And so that's the other side of it.
I mean, in 2015, World Championships for powerlifting was in Finland. And so the first thing I did was I got over there like 6 days beforehand, let myself get relatively adjusted. But I did, there was no real way for me to train myself to get ready for it because I was competing in like the mid morning over there, which was like the middle of the night here. Right. But I did start training like later at night, later into the afternoons, trying to get myself a little bit that way. But I think that's one thing I can say to athletes, like an individual sport like powerlifting or Olympic weightlifting or golf or whatever. If you have a long way to travel, the sooner you can get there, probably the better.
For sure.
To get adjusted. And then actually what was uniquely interesting in Finland was in the summer, which is when I went, it is light for 22 hours a day. Like it doesn't even get like night. It just gets kind of duskish, and then the sun comes back up at like 2 a.m. And so, I had I bought a black bed sheet at the store, put it up over the window. I had eye mask, sound machine.
I tell you now, just with any travel that I do the same thing. Sound machine. I bring little, like black duct tape to put over the lights that are everywhere. They like bright lights are shining off of like the
It's always
fire.
the side table, thing that they got, the Bluetooth thing
I'll
with
cover
big
them
old
all.
bright letters, and
it's just a routine. Like it's I don't know. I guess it seemed weird at first, but for me, it just works better. I like it. It has to be dark, and there has to be a certain temperature, and that does. It is hard, especially if you're traveling like with your whole family or whatever. But if it's just you can pretty much knock it out. The last note on that travel is, which I think we've hit plenty, but you can adjust those times pretty easily until you factor in life. Mm-hmm. So, for example, I know athletes that will shift it, but if some of those athletes actually have children, now you can't like stay up all night and then function with them and do anything normal and then try to compete. All of it has to do with your lifestyle, what you can tolerate, what your primary goal is at that point.
Yeah, I think people forget that athletes are people too, and they're like, oh, this guy had a bad game. What happened? This and that. And it's like, well, what they don't know is he was fighting with his wife, his kid's sick. There's all these other outside stressors that are coming in.
Right.
But people, nobody's going to want to hear that when it comes crunch time, right? And great athletes, I think the best, what they're really good at is compartmentalization, and being able to, okay, when it's time to go, you drop the hammer and you can block everything else out, which is really, really difficult. Yeah. Just imagine for the listeners out there, like how many ruminating thoughts you might have throughout the day of things that are bothering you. And now imagine that you are trying to go up against, I just think about like the Super Bowl just happened, people think that, they can just focus on this game. No, their whole family and friends are out there. They're trying to take care of tickets and all that sort of thing.
I'll tell you, at the collegiate level, we don't often remember these students have classes.
Right.
And so like there's this whole other life that a normal student has these stresses. Then you add like competing in front of a large crowd and NILs and how you got to compete and all this stuff.
I can't even being an 18-year-old kid in like football, for example, $1 million on the line, and now you're in front of 100,000 people. I'm thinking about myself at 18 years old. Like, there's no way. And I do worry about these kids with all this money, all this pressure. Like, I see why some people crack. It's a tough gig.
Yeah. I think that it certainly is a tough gig. They've got more tools at their disposal than ever, which is also helpful. But you got to be the right mentality to be an elite athlete, no doubt about it.
So let's talk about, since, like you said, a lot of the practices in the afternoon, evening, a lot of competitions in the evening. Obviously, that comes with, one, your nervous system turns up for a competition. How does that affect sleep? Two, a lot of people having some caffeine before they compete. I know I do. And funny enough, last time I competed at Nationals in 2024, I was in what they called prime time. So they used to do powerlifting meets where it'd just be in the morning or whatever throughout the day. And then they realized, if we want eyeballs on this, we got to put this in prime time. So the top lifters, they take them and put them at 7 p.m., right? And I'm like, 700 milligrams of caffeine hits different at 6 o'clock in the afternoon, right? So I'm like, well, we're not sleeping that night. So is there anything, any kind of like, okay, if somebody's got to compete or train at night, they don't have other options, and even if they like caffeine, that sort of thing, what advice would you have for them?
Yeah.
You're screwed.
Yeah. You got two thoughts on it, right? Like if you're at the level that's your job or that's the one thing, then just you got to do it.
Yeah.
And you got to take the consequence at the end, unfortunately. There are probably nuanced techniques to sort of mitigate what that means, but if performance is your livelihood or it's like the world championships and you got to compete one time, like
right,
be ready. And then you just have to accept that you're going to probably have a longer sleep wind down routine. You might have a bad night. I think it all comes down to what's the objective, what's the goal, and then do you have to compete tomorrow? Because hopefully you got like some other time afterwards to get back to normal. But you're not going to get an athlete to not do everything possible to be the world champion because you didn't want to take caffeine and have trouble sleeping for one night.
Right, and that's where things like it really is sport dependent. Like for me, I'm not really worried if I don't sleep the night after competition. Who cares, right? Like I've got however many months until I'm going to compete again. If you're an NFL football player doing a night game, less of a big deal, right? Because you got a whole week to get ready unless you're doing a Thursday night game or whatever it is. But if you're a Major League Baseball player, I mean, there's a lot of times these guys have night games followed by day games. And I would love to really see the performance literature on that. You know, I would bet that there is some significant differences. Because obviously if you're playing at night consistently, I think NBA is mostly at night, except on the weekends. If you're playing at night consistently, you get adjusted to that. They're probably staying up later, going to bed later, waking up later, right? But if it's inconsistent, you're playing like every single day, like Major League Baseball. That has to be really, really tough.
So I don't know with baseball specifically, but I'm aware of data from Sherry Ma, who's a sleep expert that's associated with our facility at the Institute of Sports Sciences and Medicine. And she used to be on ESPN doing these, what's called the Ma score. And she predicted NBA outcomes, not by if your player was injured, not by anything other than your travel schedule. And she was beating Vegas spread like all the time. Interesting. Which is really cool. So she just said, where are you traveling to and what time's the game? So it didn't even account for your best player sitting out or being hurt or whatever it was. It was only travel, and she was winning with this score that was posted on ESPN Weekly, which is really neat. And so time and time again, the literature does show if you're a West Coast team playing on the East Coast, you're going to perform better because the games here are like 9 at night start, but that's only 6 for you. And so you're hitting in a circadian time when you're more likely to peak. And so many, many times that's an advantage depending on which way you're traveling. Yeah,
absolutely. So let's shift gears to something you discussed earlier. You mentioned John Ivey's work. You mentioned nutrient timing. Any take-homes from your research about like what might be better for exercise, nutrient timing? Does that stuff matter that much?
Yeah, I'm familiar with some of the stuff you've said about this in the past too. I think we'll probably align pretty well on it. I love that early data. Like it was so cool to sort of dig into and see how important it was, how much our muscle could soak up straight after a workout. And it was a compelling argument. I think I still believe it. Like I still practice it.
Same.
Although I think we can be a little more relaxed about it. Yeah. But I don't see any problem with timing things as best you can to right after your workout, for example. I do it in practice. But I'm, even though I'm not a competitive, at any elite level, like I want every little advantage I can get. Sure. I just don't think we have to be concerned about it. If I forget something, what Sean Arndt put out the garage door instead of like the window of opportunity. And so I think post workout, we just have a lot longer to think through that. Although I don't love all the studies that were in those reviews on those different studies, but I do think that post workout is an opportunity where you are pretty well primed to handle those nutrients. You can do a lot of good with it. When I've worked with bodybuilders, for example, and figure competitors, there was if we were like worried about when carbohydrates were coming in, for example, I would time them all to around that exercise, and we had really good outcomes in terms of like, that's a great time to use them. You can use them for the exercise. You can then restore them, and then we sort of taper those off the rest of the day. So there is a use for it. I just don't think we have to be. Most people don't need to care about it. If you're interested in the nuance, I think it could provide a small advantage. Yeah.
So when we were growing up, a lot of the muscle magazines said you need a lot of protein right after your workout. Basically like as soon as you finish your last set, hook up an IV and get those amino acids in there.
Yeah. I used to write for those magazines.
Yeah, same. And then the idea was also exercise makes you more insulin sensitive because you have an upregulation of GLUT4 receptors that's insulin independent from exercise. And GLUT4 is the glucose receptor in muscle cells. So the idea was you're more insulin sensitive after a workout. Yeah. So now's the time to pump in some carbohydrates, plus you refuel your glycogen. And that's what we grew up with. And I'm the same. Like I think if you look at the research literature now, it basically says if nutrient timing matters, it matters a really small amount, especially for building muscle. But in practice, I still do it. One, because that's what I grew up with. That's the habit I got into. And that's just, there's no downside to it, right? Other than if you're somebody who that doesn't like to feel full when you work out, you have GI issues, those sorts of things, then maybe you can practice it differently. But it really is more about what you do over a 24-hour period. And I always chuckle when I see, like, even to this day, like, bodybuilders who will train for an hour or whatever it is, and they're having, intra-workout cyclic dextrin, and I'm just like, this is way overkill, guys. My personal opinion is, okay, it's a good idea to have multiple protein feedings per day. I tell people 3 to 5. If you really want to, like, build as much muscle as you can, 3 to 5 protein feedings per day, relatively evenly spaced out. One of those naturally will probably fall a few hours before your workout, and one of those naturally will probably fall a few hours after your workout. And if you're hitting that, if you're bracketing it like that, I think you're fine.
Yeah.
With carbohydrate, I do take in some more before. I do take in more after. But what I will tell you is lifting weights really isn't, unless you're going for a really long time, not really a glycogen depleting sort of.
Well, I think one of the cool pieces of that story too is, like, in all that original literature, you sort of forget what you ate before. Because almost everything was after. Yeah. And so if you count real life where you're eating before.
And a lot of these studies are doing it fasted. They're exercising fasted and eating after.
Because you need to find the answer. But, like, if you've eaten before and you've taken care of all that, then the after one's probably even less important. Yeah. At that time. But still, I'll still do it.
Yeah, same. Yeah. And, I tell people, it's more about, first of all, if you're getting in enough calories and glucose or carbohydrate overall, your glycogen is going to be fine, right? Doing an hour arm workout is not sucking 400 grams of glucose out of your body. Like, that's not happening, right? So if you aren't having a ton of really fast digesting carbohydrate afterwards, you're going to be just fine, right? On the other side of that, I would see people say, well, because it used to be you'd have dextrose after your workout. That was a lot of the popular kind of bodybuilding lore. And then people were like, well, it's basically the same thing as candy, right? So now they have, like, Sour Patch Kids or whatever it is, which love me some Sour Patch Kids. People say, well, I worry about becoming type 2 diabetic. And my response to that always was like, there's a pretty big difference between somebody who's training hard and having some glucose at a time for a very targeted reason versus somebody who's sitting on the couch watching TV and just slamming down candy. Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, like we said before, that exercise is such a metabolic sledgehammer. So it just is. It's wonderful. It helps in so many different ways. You made me think of some of those different types of modified carbohydrates. And we've actually worked with some of those that are hydrothermally modified to be either fast or slow digesting. And when you do that, as you know, you take away the amylose-amylopectin ratio and how that even matters at all for what that does for digestibility and speed. And so we've done a lot with the slow digesting. And I think that's kind of a neat area, because what I love about performance nutrition is it is a field in which sometimes sports nutrition crosses into medical nutrition, and sometimes it's the opposite. So, like, creatine was, like, basically sports nutrition that's going medical. And then we had things like UCAN Superstarch, for example, which started medical with glycogen storage disease and then went to performance, which was like this slow drip of glucose. So not necessarily with, like, the timing aspect, but you can modify these things in way different ways to potentially fuel you more optimally at a certain time or a certain type of exercise, which is a really cool area.
Yeah. So we were talking about this off camera. So a new paper came out from some colleagues that, like, I know, Andrew Kutnick. Yeah. He sent me the paper. I have not had a chance to look through it myself thus far. It's
a big paper.
Yeah. But some of the hot takes on social media were basically like, the idea that you need carbohydrates for endurance exercise is complete nonsense, and you can get by with a low carb diet, which my impression of literature is if you are doing very long duration, low intensity endurance exercise, you probably don't need to eat a high carb diet. You can probably be fine on a low carb diet. But anything once you're getting above 65, 70% VO2 max, I think it's hard to argue that carbohydrates are not helpful. But you had Andrew come speak to your students.
Yeah.
I assume you looked through this paper. What's your take home from things? Are carbs useful for endurance exercise, or have we all been sold lies?
Yes, Andrew's excellent. He's a great researcher, and he's a research scientist at the institute. And that paper got a lot of publicity. For sure, because I think it brought into frame a question a lot of people have, and there's such really diverse feelings about carbohydrates. Yes. And so, it got a lot of play. Once Andrew came and explained the entire paper to us from his perspective, it was just very clear that we agreed on way more than we did. And so I would be more traditional in that I think carbohydrates are useful at the very high end of exercise and for elite. This paper wasn't about elite. Mm-hmm. It wasn't about elite performance, which I think if you talk to any coach or practitioner who works with the elite, like the Tour de France riders and these elite runners and stuff, they're still feeding carbohydrates. There's probably one-off examples where they don't, but mostly you're feeding carbohydrates. I think it's looking at metabolic flexibility, just kind of flipping the coin over. So a long time we've talked about using different fuels at different times based on need, and you want your body to be able to react to that, either fast or slow, how quickly you use those, how long you can use, for example, fat as a source before you shift over to carbohydrate. And so to me, it just reframed those different ideas. I think we agreed on several things. So number one, what works for you. Number two, we think blood glucose should probably be maintained to have an optimal performance, but that's not new. Since the 60s, there's been debates from the physiologists about liver glycogen contribution to blood glucose and how much muscle. And in different studies that have existed where they've had situations where muscle glycogen was depleted, but blood glucose was fine. And they've done it in reverse where you have, high opportunities for performance at different values of glucose in the different depots, meaning blood, liver, and muscle. And so I think the biggest point is depending on what exercise you're doing and what your eating style is, we all know you need to sort of balance these in some way to have a good blood glucose response. So in that way, I don't think it's new. They just kind of flipped it. And the authors, some of the authors are sort of notorious low carb individuals, which may or may not bias what's happening.
Sure.
But the nuance is still the same. Carbohydrates at the elite end are still there. I think they brought up some good points in that for most people, we probably don't need as many carbohydrates for performance as we're saying, because you're not winning the race. You're just competing. Right. And we can probably do just fine with a lower amount. And perhaps that's better metabolically over time. They had one section that was about these elite people potentially developing prediabetes. Mm-hmm. I haven't seen that. The data weren't clear yet on if that's happening, but I don't see it at the high level. And I've asked some of my friends who are coaches of the elite, and they don't see it either. But it's possible that if you're not that way and you're just in the middle or even high end of performance, but not elite, we probably don't need quite as many.
Yeah. I mean, I think when you're talking about carbs versus fats, you're basically talking about two different types of fuel sources. And we know from the research literature, protein and calories kind of determine body composition. Carbohydrates versus fats, you can kind of flip a coin. When it comes to anaerobic exercise, very clearly, if you're eating low carb, you're going to have some performance decrements. Maybe not in some forms of resistance training, but if you're getting into that window where you're going hard for, even resistance training in a set, 30 to 90 seconds, carbohydrates probably matter, at least a certain amount. Maybe not, you might not have to load up on them.
Yeah. And that was kind of their point. It's maybe the way I interpret it, it wasn't so dichotomous. It's we probably just don't need quite as many as we thought, but I think we've all in this field been knowing that for a long time. It's just reframed and sort of packaged in this nice paper that explains it. But there are some pieces to it, they're trying to make an argument of what causes fatigue, and is it low muscle glycogen, is it low liver glycogen, is it central in the brain, and the argument's that it's central. And so I think a lot of us we agree on that. I think there's a mix though of muscular, peripheral and central fatigue that are going on. For resistance training, I think you're spot on. For endurance training, I mean, some people are saying that if you change your diet so greatly by reducing carbohydrates and the outcome is no difference in performance, you better like eating that way, because there's really no point. Your performance is still the same, unless maybe it's causing you this prediabetes, which we just don't know yet. And I would think if you're training hard enough, it's probably less of an issue. I just don't know a lot of people that are training really, really hard and have those issues.
Yeah, I mean, I think, like I said, the research outcomes I've seen for low carb diets basically suggest in most contexts, it's not superior that I've ever seen for performance.
Yeah, it might be the same.
Might be same, might be worse. If you really like eating that way, and you personally, like Zach Bitter is an ultra endurance athlete who eats low carb, but I do think he uses targeted periods of carbohydrate eating as well. But if you like eating that way, you feel good, you know yourself, because research data are averages, are means. You are an individual data point. And when it comes down to the individual, what you will adhere to consistently is by far a much bigger lever than what is theoretically optimal by 1% or 2%. No doubt. So whatever you can stick with is important. Yeah, and in this, it's not sexy, but it's true.
It is true. And I think, and they pulled out of this too, is no matter if you were on this low carbohydrate diet or a high carbohydrate diet, both groups improved with 10 grams per hour of carbohydrate intake on top of it. So that was like the blood part of it. We just need to have enough in the blood to take care of that. But liver should do that just fine. And most people are fueling while they train if they're going that far in endurance. The only other piece to it, I think, was more the efficiency of carbohydrate use in terms of oxygen utilization.
Yep.
And so that wasn't brought up a ton in that piece of it. But at the very high end, like 90% plus VO2 max, you got to be thinking a little bit about that efficiency of how much oxygen you need to oxidize the fuel.
Yeah, and that's something I've heard before too, and people don't realize. It's like, okay, you produce more ATP per gram of fat, but you produce more ATP per oxygen molecule when you're talking about carbohydrate. And that, at those levels where that becomes limiting, that matters.
Yeah.
And as far as like elite athletes becoming type 2 diabetic, I've heard of it. It's very, very rare. And I think it is unlikely due to carbohydrate intake and much more likely due to genetics. And
not to mention, a lot of times that's post competition.
Yeah.
And massive body comp changes.
Oh, yeah.
So there's that.
Yeah. And they do show, especially athletes who have to cut weight repeatedly, much more likely to be obese or overweight afterwards.
Yeah.
And really, like, genetically disposition, it sounds, we were talking about this earlier, it sounds counterintuitive, but people who have fewer fat cells in terms of number are actually less resistant to type 2 diabetes than people who have more. And you can find people who are very obese, who are not type 2 diabetic, who have like relatively normal levels of blood glucose and blood lipids. Usually if you, in research studies, if you biopsy that person's adipose tissue, they have more fat cells. And the reason that matters is because each individual fat cell kind of has a max of what it can absorb before it just becomes structurally not viable. And so that max seems to be around 100 microns in diameter. And so what you see is as people get close to that max, as those fat cells start filling up, you start to get blood glucose and lipids backing up into the bloodstream because you just don't have any place left to put them. Now, again, what I make my argument here is if you get people more active, exercise, diet, you start to see resolution of blood markers, not in months and years, but in weeks. Like it's very quickly. You just start making some throughput and you start seeing those blood markers resolve because that is just residual left over. Now, also one of the treatments for type 2 diabetes is sulfonylureas, which are PPAR gamma agonists, and those produce more fat cells. And the reason this matters is when you have smaller fat cells, they are much more insulin sensitive and it's very easy for them to soak up extra lipids. Okay. Think about like if you have a towel, right? And it's really dry. If there's water on this table, it'll get most of it, right? But if it's already sopping wet and I try to soak it up, nothing's going to happen. Fat cells are a little bit like that. And also like the rebound effect. People have to get really lean for competition. MMA fighters, wrestlers, bodybuilders. I mean, you see after they overfeed for a little while, they put on fat very quickly. And everybody goes, it's water. No. They put on a lot of fat very quickly because their fat cells are so insulin sensitive, because they are so small that they are just primed to take all that excess lipid up. So I think, getting back to your point, if we're looking at athletes who end up becoming type 2 diabetic, that's probably a genetic predisposition just from having so few fat cells. Cool thing is they can probably get pretty lean and stay pretty lean pretty easy. Yeah. Downside is if they start to put on some weight, much more prone to type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, for sure. I think just kind of, you made me think of this, which is really neat concept with how the training influences adiposity. And the fat cell number. So some of this work's being done. I think it's fascinating where we now know that not only just myokines produced from muscle, but other markers leaving the muscle actually talk to fat to reduce the fat number. So we have this crosstalk going on that we didn't know about forever. We thought it might be happening, but now they're actually like starting to show this kind of thing, which I think is one of the most fascinating things. Like the training you're doing actually influences your adiposity. The muscle talks to the fat.
Yeah, and I mean, there's so many ways we could go with this. You know, in terms of tissues, adipose turns over probably one of the slowest, if not the slowest of any tissue I know of. The life of an adipocyte is around 10 years. So there was argument for a long period of time. Can you change your adipocyte number? I think the research says yes, but it takes a long time. And it's usually in people who are very obese, who kind of start to hit that limit of what can be stored in fat. And it kind of makes sense too. People who are obese for long periods of time, the research, some of it suggests that you're better off just maintaining an adiposity versus losing it, gaining it, losing it, gaining it, losing it, gaining it. And some of that may be due to what happens in terms of stability with fat cell number. So, I mean, all this stuff is very interesting, but I think when it comes to athletes, I'm not concerned about consuming carbohydrate making you a type 2 diabetic is my personal take
especially
home.
During activity.
Yeah. I think a lot of what happens is athletes, you know, they're used to eating like athletes, training like athletes. Stop. But food habits become habits. And if you're used to expending thousands of calories per day, and then all of a sudden you go to, even if you're still working out, it's not going to be the same, and you still keep eating the same, I mean, you're going to add some body fat. So there are a lot of athletes, again, especially athletes who have to make weight, boxers, combat athletes, bodybuilder, they retire and they don't look the same, you know?
It changes a little bit.
All right. I want to switch gears here. One more topic I wanted to hit on, and that's collagen. Okay. Because you mentioned briefly that you've done some work with collagen. Yeah. And so I want to get, what is your take on collagen? Do you think it's useful for anything? What did you find in your research?
Yeah, so we started doing collagen work in the beginning because I didn't believe any of it. I wanted to see what it did. I saw some of the literature coming out that was showing changes in muscle mass, which I didn't believe. And it was all from one lab in particular over and over, which is not always a terrible thing, but it was like, okay, only one place is showing this. It doesn't make much sense to me because the amino acid profile is so different from collagen from like a whey. And so we started sort of looking at ways to explore this topic, but with a focus on joint pain. And because I wanted to look at middle-aged people with joint pain. Can you believe that? So that's the way we designed it. It was middle-aged and older. And
it's one of those selfish things
and
again, huh?
Lifelong athletes. So we got people who've been training their whole lives.
Right.
In one way or another. It could have been golf. It could have been tennis. It could have been bodybuilding. But mixed in there, we had elite triathletes. We had one of the world championship masters CrossFit athletes. We had like several people that were very high end. So all types of different exercise backgrounds. They just did it regularly. And then we decided to run, which is still, to my knowledge, the longest running collagen supplement study ever. Okay. So we did 9 continuous months of collagen supplementation. This was all run by one of my doc students at the time, Shaloa Kievkovsky. She's fabulous, and she still works in collagen space now. But that 9-month study took about 5 years to run, which research just takes forever to do. And it started out as a 6-month study, but then we were interested in potentially bone outcomes. And so we gave the participants an add-on. If they wanted to stay on, they could do 3 more months of this and carry on. Our primary outcomes were joint pain. We tried to measure things with a goniometer for like range of motion, but that got to be a mess quickly with where you place it, how it's measured, what did you do before you came in? All those things changed it, and just we couldn't use those data. And we took a ton of blood to see if there's anything mechanistically we could look at with collagen production or degradation.
And then how much collagen were they having per day?
So we decided to compare 0, 10, and 20. So it was a dosing study because a lot of the literature was in skincare. And that really was around 10 to 20 grams. And so we were trying to decide, should we just do like a 0 and a 20? But we're like, well, we should probably see what the dosing strategy is. So we had 3 groups and they did 0, 10, or 20 for 9 months. Not everybody stayed on for 9 months, but 6 to 9 months long. And I'll tell you, I didn't think it was going to work. There were data in young athletes that said it did. I'm like, how could a young athlete who doesn't have any joint pain have better joint pain? And so it didn't make much sense. But when our data came out that particularly the 10-gram dose, 20 also was kind of effective, but the 10-gram dose was most effective.
Interesting.
And I'd have no idea why. But the 10-gram dose is what tended to kind of move the needle the most in all the metrics we looked at, but only for the people who were most active. So once we took all the minutes of exercise per day of all these different types of people who exercised, if you were over roughly 150 minutes per week is when they saw the most effect on joint pain. Now, a couple caveats. You had to take it for a very long time. It was all subjective, right? And at the end of the day, 10 grams was better than 20, and we don't know why. So a lot of problems in there, but it was enough to move the needle for me. It was one of the things that my own data changed that I take it just to try to do something. And it's a very easy habit for me to add 10 grams a day. And it's not for anything other than joint pain.
And subjectively, have you felt like you noticed a difference?
I have no idea.
This is the problem of being a scientist. You're like, it could be placebo. I don't know.
I have no idea.
I don't believe anything anymore.
I don't know. But our people, so what was cool though is not only was the joint pain in the most active people but like dampened.
Right.
That makes sense, right? Because it's hard to get blood flow to areas like a joint knee pain.
Right.
And so like all the stuff with Keith Barr and his great work in collagen, typically you're taking it right before exercise.
Yep.
We also didn't give it with vitamin C, which you should. And we didn't control like their exercise protocol. So we had like a free living environment. So now that could be a negative, but for me, it's a positive in that these people actually felt reductions. And then if they had less joint pain, they had better sort of feelings of less mental stress and like better feelings of joy and, on a profile mood state scale that all showed a benefit. Less pain, feel better mentally. Yeah.
Okay. So just, the people who followed me for a while know I'm very skeptical of collagen.
Yeah. I'm wondering what you're going to say now.
Well, I mean, I think, so if I had to take it from a very skeptical point of view, the first thing would be, well, typically things that work in a dose fashion. You might have a plateau. So I was going to ask you about the statistics. Was this a situation where 20 was no different than 0 or 20 was no different than 10? Or were they all
most metrics, 10 and 20 were different than 0.
Okay.
When we compared 10 and 20, some of them had no difference and some of them favored 10.
Okay.
And so it wasn't that 20
depending on the stats you used.
Correct. And it wasn't that 20 didn't do anything. It was that 10 seemed to have a better hit on most metrics.
Okay.
And I just don't know why.
Yeah. And look, there's always the opportunity that it's random chance, especially when you're dealing with subjective questionnaires. The other thing I was going to ask is, were they aware of what they were getting, or was it like placeboed in terms of like a similar shake for each?
Yeah, similar shake, all blinded, same way to consume it, everything randomized.
So that's good.
Over the whole time. We did measures every month for 9 months with big blood draws at 3, 6, and 9.
Okay. And did you see any differences in the objective markers in the blood draws?
those are still being reviewed.
Got it.
Yeah.
Got it.
So there are some things that Shiloh is still analyzing now from those blood samples, but until we get that back, we don't know about mechanistic work at all. I'll tell you from a sneak peek at it, it looks like there might be one or two things moving, but that never convinces me fully.
Yeah.
What I like is that obviously I care if something works or not, but the people who took it and had these outcomes, even if it's a placebo, that's great.
Right.
like I hope it works for you.
Yeah.
And so for me, not a muscular growth type of product, not a recovery product, maybe joint pain. I like that we ran it because I trust it. We did 9 months of it, which is the longest to date. And I was around these people. Like they really had some great things to say about it. Not that that's going to convince me the data has to show what the data show, but it was enough for me to include it in my routine.
Interesting. Yeah. I mean, I my thing is I'll tell people, okay, first off, from talk about muscle growth, recovery, amino acid perspective, horrific. Like the lowest source of leucine you can possibly find. But collagen, obviously important in connective tissue. But one thing I tell people is, listen, it's not like you're taking collagen and it's going into your bloodstream and getting directly incorporated.
Yeah, which they're marketing. So that's a troublesome spot.
Right. You are ingesting an intact protein, which is then going through digestion, proteolysis. It's entering your bloodstream as single amino acids, dipeptides, tripeptides, mostly, maybe some shorter peptides as well. But the question is, okay, so then how does it work, right? Because some of those amino acids do they wind up in the blood in quantitative values? I don't know if there's some blood, I actually don't know that. I think glycine is pretty common in collagen. I think glycine actually does survive first pass metabolism pretty well.
Glycine, proline, hydroxyproline, di and tripeptides are what they're saying the key to it is. Mm-hmm. I've seen in animal literature as large as a 9 amino acid peptide getting through intact.
Yeah. That wouldn't surprise me. Yeah.
So that's the largest I've seen. The magic is supposed to be in the glycine, proline, hydroxyproline helix.
Right.
The most convincing data isn't even our data. It's actually Keith Barr's work.
Yep.
They have several studies, but when they were able to deliver collagen and with vitamin C, so it's activated, and then they did jump rope, like skipping rope. And so they gave it 15 minutes later, did the jump roping, and then they had several different outcomes, but they were showing improvements in these tendon outcomes and growth and markers that should lead to growth of tendon, these types of things. So there's some mechanistic data, which is pretty neat. Again, it's one that I didn't believe at all. And I think that there's enough in the joint pain space that it's plausible. Mm-hmm. And again, for me, if it's not going to hurt me and it might help me and I got a ton of access to it, I'm going to do it.
Yeah. So I some of the studies I really honed in on were out of Luc Van Loon's lab that you mentioned earlier.
Yeah.
Because they've done some studies
They're
in
great.
connective tissue synthesis. And basically what they showed was doesn't increase connective tissue synthesis compared to whey. So the question then becomes all right, I'd like to see that with a no trial just to see, okay, are both of them increasing connective tissue synthesis? Because then you could say, okay, well then if you're taking in whey, maybe you're getting the same benefits.
Perfect example. And I think that many, many, many of the studies, including ours, we didn't compare it to whey.
Right. And also okay, you are getting in some extra protein. So is it the protein just helping with just globally, or is there something specific to it? Right.
100%. And so I think that's the beautiful thing about running a research facility is that, I've got teams in performance nutrition, orthopedics and sports medicine, immunology that are all running studies. And so we can incorporate these things, and we need to, because we can ask questions just like this. We can take from this, I'm like, you know what? We should go run that. I love the ability to do that. And I think that's an advantage of being at an institute like I'm at now.
Yeah. And I always tell people the most I ever learned was sitting in lab meetings with my lab mates and with Dr. Layne and just volleying around ideas and poking holes and stuff and discussing research papers. I learned so much doing that. You really we were talking about this earlier. People say, well, do you really need a PhD to like understand literature? And I would say, no, you don't necessarily. But by the time you put the work in to be able to really understand, if you really understand it, you might as well have gone and gotten a PhD because it is a lot of work.
Yeah. I think the difference, and you might have spoken about it before, but like doing research and doing research.
A big difference.
They're different things.
Yeah. Yeah. And especially when you're talking about, it's funny. I'll never forget. The first experimental biology I went to, which by the way, for everybody who not familiar, experimental biology is like the Arnold Classic Expo for science nerds. There's a bunch of people with booths and posters and stuff. Yeah. And I didn't give a speech my first year. This is 2007, I want to say. I just had a poster. Might have been 2008. And the first person who came up to my poster was Jeff Volek. And, Volek is very well known in exercise science, very impactful researcher. Yeah. And he looks at my poster and goes, oh, this stuff's way more advanced than what we do. And I'm like, what? Because I've got like Western blots and I've got signaling data up there and everything. It's like, oh yeah, he's like, our data is easy. We put somebody on a treadmill and then, instantly we know what their data is, right? Yeah. Like there's something to that signaling data, the metabolism data, like you're saying, 5 years to work through stuff. Yeah. Like this stuff takes a long time.
Yeah, and I think in research in general, we always tell my students this, like, we're training you to be very critical, but like we have to always remember that the people running these studies are trying, I would assume, are trying their hardest. They design it, they take years of their life to do it, and we shred it apart. And it's like, they really are trying to do good work. They might not have had the experience. Maybe they just couldn't control that variable. And so I always try to caution, like, take it with a grain of salt, like, find the good points also, not just the negative points in all these different papers.
Yeah, I think, everyone does this, and I talk about asymmetrical application of logic, right? Like something fits my bias, my critical thinking skills go through the floor, right? And then if something's against my bias, then I'm very critically thinking, right? We all do this. It's bias. And I tell people all the time, I think what people think is a lot of the research out there is just completely fabricated. That does happen, but I think it's much more rare than people realize. I think what tends to leak in more so is personal bias, the way a study's designed, the way the statistics are analyzed, those sorts of things. I think that's what creeps in a lot more. Because usually if I see a research study where I go, that doesn't make sense in terms of the conclusion, I read how they set it up, I go, okay, I can understand how they found this.
Right. But that takes a critical eye to look at.
Yeah. And I think what I'll tell people is like, listen, the scientific method is perfect. Okay. Science is what is. It's not your science, my science. It's just science. Okay. But it is done by people, and people are not perfect. I have bias. You have bias. We're human beings. It is impossible not to. Yeah. What I tell people is like, I trust people who are upfront with their bias a lot more than people who aren't, who say they have no bias. Yeah. The people who say they have no bias are usually the most biased people.
We do a lot of research. We've got federal funded, we've got industry funded, we've got locally funded. Like, it takes a lot to run a big research facility.
It does.
But when we publish industry funded work, a lot of the times the comments right away are like, oh, it's funded by blah, blah, blah. Like, I'm like, you know what? At FSC, I can't even take a grant where I don't have 100% rights to publish whatever I find. I can't sign the contract. I'm not allowed to do it. The university won't allow it. It's called unfavorable terms, and it is squashed. Yep. And so I think that not everybody knows that. And I think when you list your conflicts of interest, if they exist, that shows that you're at least showing that you are associated with these companies, or you got a grant from them or whatever it is. And if you get a grant, that doesn't mean they're paying for your pool guy. It means they're funding the lab. They're funding a student to run the project.
Yeah, you guys got to eat, funny enough,
Yes. It's just a different perspective. And so, we've been doing this for 20 years basically, and almost all of it was industry funded. Now we have federal, we have some DOD funding as well, but all that industry stuff, almost every time I don't find a significant finding. But we still get data. We still get the next grant, because I think we're a trusted place now where people know that we'll do really good work, but we're going to publish whatever we find.
Yeah, that's important. Some grants, this usually doesn't happen at really reputable research facilities or universities, but the company will say, well, we'll fund it, but if the findings aren't in our favor, you can't publish it. And that does happen. But most places like where I was at, where you're at, I mean, these big institutions, reputable programs, they say it's going to get published one way or the other. I honestly think, what is a bigger problem is the asymmetrical publication of null hypothesis versus non-null hypothesis. And what I mean by that is if you have a finding of a difference, it is more likely to get published, all things being equal, than a study that finds no difference. I think that's more problematic than funding source, to be quite honest. And just to give people some idea, this can be a case of reverse causation too, right? So people say, well, your research was funded by beef, egg, and dairy. Of course you found these positive outcomes. Well, if I think leucine is important for muscle protein synthesis, am I going to go to a collagen company, or am I going to go to a company that sells wheat protein or soy protein or some of the lower, well, soy's not really low in leucine, but some of the lower leucines? No, I'm going to go to the companies that I'm like, hey, look, we think leucine's important. You are a high leucine product.
Well, even with some of these specific products, like if you're making an off the shelf product that I want to test, who's going to fund that other than that company? And they want to see if their product works, and hopefully the company will take the information, good, bad, or ugly, and make an improvement.
Right.
That's the goal. And that doesn't always happen. Sometimes it makes things get pulled off the shelf, and sometimes it does nothing, but the data are still the data. They're going to come out. Yep.
The data is what the data is. On that note, same question I asked all my guests. You already answered one, so maybe you've got another example. What's a belief that you held strongly that you changed your mind on with data?
Yeah, so I sort of mentioned some of the earlier ones. The collagen one flipped the other way.
Yeah.
Where I changed to using it.
Yep.
I think the protein timing one is also one because I was hyper focused on it. And like I said, I still do it, but my opinion's completely changed. I give different advice to people who don't care as much about the nuance.
Right.
And let them be a little more lax about it. So that was one that changed for me as well. And I think there are just a number of examples where it's not necessarily like grounded in a study that showed a specific outcome, but my opinion based on lots of different studies is how more relaxed we can be about almost everything and how important exercise is in driving any physiological impact you want to have. I do performance nutrition, and so like I'm saying, I think that the exercise is more important. They work in conjunction, but
for sure.
But so much of the data has pointed to the massive impact that exercise has, and so for me, that's changed. And then I think just in like real application, I used to say this to when I was coaching more. Just put it on your calendar.
Yeah,
it'll get done.
Yeah.
And it turns out that when you have kids and other responsibilities and stuff, that's harder to pull. It helps.
Yeah.
But I would say it helps now. And I think as I get older, I think I connect more with, you connect more people like your own age moving through.
Yeah.
And before I had children, I would give advice to people who had children. Like, you don't know what you're talking about. Like, and I was like, yes, I do. And it turns out, no, I didn't. Like, it's a whole wake up call once you bring in this other part of your life.
Yep. It's the meme of like the 20-year-old personal trainer telling the mother, single mom of 3, to just make the time. She didn't want it bad enough,
Exactly.
Yeah, I mean, there's so much stuff you said there that I really identify with, and one of them is too, like, my change of mind comes usually in phases and shifts slowly over time, and I think scientific consensus is the same, and if you're doing it right, that's how it should be. You don't want. If we were just going to change our minds every time a new study came out, like it could be like a ping pong ball, right?
Oh, for sure. And that's what confuses everybody.
Yeah.
Because we have these studies that are conflicting, but those don't matter as much as the whole host of information you're going to get from all the studies.
What is the consensus of the research literature? How often has it been replicated? Over how much time? How many different labs, different funding sources? And what you find is that if something is robust, replication is the mother of all science. And it transfers across populations, across labs. I mean, I think the single proudest thing I have is that most of my research that was in rodents, but got replicated in humans, mostly big shout out to Stu Phillips for doing a lot of that. because that's important. Because if you can't replicate it, then again, there can be not that people made up data, but sometimes random stuff happens. It is possible. Statistics are just probabilities. That's all.
Yeah, and I think I hope that people can take from all this and like the good stuff that you're putting out all the time is like, we can trust science, but we just have to be really good at sort of interpreting the host of it and finding aspects of science that we don't just get so held onto with these religious beliefs, and we just get into the how can we interpret this in an evidence-led fashion? Maybe not evidence-based, because we don't have that for every single thing, but like based on these outcomes, what can we do? And we got to get back to a place where scientists can communicate effectively to get some data to the public, and it's not looked at in this way that is so negative. Something that's been going on for a little while now.
Well, I think I think that COVID in particular did a real disservice to science, and in my opinion, one of the big reasons of that is typically in history, if there was a topic that came up, you'd have decades of research, a bunch of scientists arguing at conferences, in, letters to the editor and all that kind of stuff. And after 30 years, we emerge from behind the curtain and we go, we think, right?
Yeah.
And what you had happen was people saw the scientific process play out right before their eyes.
Yeah.
Well, this study came out and said this in this population. Well, here's a different one that says it. And it's like we were trying to build the ship while we're trying to sail the ship. And what it looked like, which is what it is that we were really unsure, because we were. And unfortunately, I think people took that as like, well, we can't trust scientists. Yeah. And it's like, no. And I said this when the whole thing went down. I said, in 30 years, we're going to look back and go, this probably would have been the best move here.
Right. Hindsight.
But hindsight, yeah, exactly. And unfortunately, like the whole thing got politicized, all that kind of stuff. And when that happens, and even I'm seeing it in nutrition now getting politicized. When that happens, it's really difficult to have conversations about this kind of stuff, because what propagates on social media is really extreme claims and very strong claims.
Yeah.
And I'll tell people, if you want to find out if somebody is really an expert, there's a few different signs. Listen to how they talk more than what they say. And if you listen to our dialogue, there's a lot of probably, maybe, likely, like very rarely we say carbs are evil, or whatever it is.
We should have done this. We should have done that. We learned this, but didn't learn that.
We're not sure. There's this other research over here that says this. Yeah. We think maybe this.
When there's a reason every paper ends with more research is needed.
Right. Exactly. And I always say the number of exclamation points and superlatives used by a person are typically inversely proportional to their knowledge. And another thing that I think gets passed up a lot is really, really intelligent people, or maybe wise is a better term, because intelligent people are actually in some ways more subjective to cognitive dissonance. Wise people know what they know and they know what they don't know. And they are not afraid to say, yeah, I'm not sure about that. I don't know.
Yeah. And I think when you have conversations with people who do the work, you'll have those outcomes. And these wild claims, that's why I like that in our facility, we're big enough now where if you did the paper, I can call you up and be like, hey, will you just zoom in and describe your paper for me?
Yeah.
And they're doing it.
Yeah.
And that is a really cool place to be, where we can get to the person who wrote the thing. And 9 times out of 10, we actually agree.
The same example of Andrew Kutnick coming and speaking to your students. And yes, I think with most scientists, we end up agreeing on more things than we disagree on, right? We tend to argue in the margins, but it's iron sharpens iron. I mean, I'll never forget my first speaking engagement in experimental biology. I got up and I think it's Charles's first name, Pinchards, who was did a lot of indirect amino acid oxidation research, very well-known researcher from Canada. Just completely dressed me down in front of like hundreds of other scientists as like a third-year grad student, right?
Oh man,
it was very humbling. It hurt, And I sat down, and Layne, he probably saw on my face that I was like really, And he said, "Listen, you did fine. typically it's kind of frowned upon to go that hard on a grad student. He goes, but I promise you, if you use this the right way, it'll be good for you. And sure enough, the next time I got up there, I'm like, I am not going to have any holes uncovered. I'm going to make sure I am buttoned up, because it did. It even though it hurt at the time, it made me better.
I would imagine that second time you didn't even get as many questions because you had everything covered in the original talk.
Oh, it's so funny. Like, in giving seminars now, what I find is I end up answering questions before they come up because I know what the questions are because I've done it so many times.
Yeah.
You know,
there's something that comes from repetitions, being in this for a long time. I remember giving a talk at like Texas ACSM, and Bob Wolf, I'm doing a pre-sleep protein talk, and Bob Wolf stands up. I'm like, oh my gosh, he's going to annihilate me. And
for those who don't know, Bob Wolf is one of the gods of protein synthesis.
Yeah, and I was talking about protein. I was a brand new assistant professor, and obviously I know who he was. And he was so lovely. And he just said, great job. That was a lot of work. And then he saved his comments for me up to after being on the stage.
Oh, that's cool.
Which is a really classy move.
Yeah. Really tall guy too, right? Yeah. He's a basketball player.
Yeah.
So I just think, unfortunately, social media, I want to be clear. I don't think social media is all bad. I think that the access to information is a good thing, and the fact that people can connect, and actually that scientists out there are actually engaging with their audience, I think is great. But it does tend to get people into more adversarial positions when in reality, a lot of times they're probably not that far apart.
Yeah.
On that note, where can people find you? Are you taking graduate students? Do you sell anything? Can we make you money in any way?
Not really. I try to sell good research and inform the public. We do have a couple places.
Boring.
That's kind of my job, right? They call me the Toyota of nutrition. I'm just steady. Anyway, there's a couple places. So just at Mike Ormsbee on any of the socials is a great place. We're trying to put out more and more great information, science that we're doing, other science that's relevant, the topics in and related to everything we talked about today. So that would be a great area. We do have one course through the great courses, which is just as boring, called Changing Body Composition Through Diet and Exercise. That's been out for about 10 years now, but it's a great course if you want like an academic. It's 24 30-minute lectures that someone could like get into the nuances a little bit, but it's for the everyday person, not a biology or biochemistry student. So that's available. But other than that, that's about it. And just follow the lab. It's just at FSU ISSM, and you'll see some good stuff from my students and our team.
And are you taking any graduate students? Can people apply right now?
Yeah, students can reach out all the time. We have filled our 2026 timeline, so we're like 2 or 3 years out at any given time. We've quite a lot of interest, and our group's phenomenal though. So if you're excellent, reach out.
Yeah, if you want to go do cool nutrition and exercise research, reach out to Mike, but make sure you give a couple years of advance notice.
That's it.
Mike, thanks, man. This was great.
Thanks, Layne. Appreciate it.